What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day, and today we have the long-awaited branded Despia deck. ALBAZ Strike structure decks are finally out, and now it's time to add some more variety to the format because we have no idea when we're gonna get a new ban list, so I feel like the only way to improve a format when you're not getting a new ban list is by adding more decks to it so you can actually have more options and see more stuff, especially now that we have like YCSs again being live and we can all enjoy watching some streams after 2 years, so the more decks we see there, the more fun the format is, and I guarantee you that this is one deck that you're going to see a lot just because of how powerful it is. It's as powerful as a deck itself, it's powerful as an engine in other decks, so it's going to make a huge plus in the format. So now, before we begin with the video, if you enjoyed, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So starting off the monsters, first of course we have 2 copies of Albert, Jester of Despia. Now the reason you're playing 2 copies in this deck is because we are including the adventure package. If you are not playing the adventure package, then you absolutely have to max out on Albert, but since the adventure package prevents you from using his effect when you normal summon him, then he can kinda contradict sometimes if you open both Water Enchantress and Aramazir with this card, so you don't really need to max it out because there are other ways to get it to the field, so you can get it consistently and use its effect as well on top of having the adventure package. And the reason the adventure package is so important in this deck is because branded fusion is a huge choke point for the deck. If it gets ashed, then your plays become much less powerful, especially if you don't have another way to fusion summon, so protecting this play is why this package is here, and you're going to see exactly how much synergy this package has with pretty much this deck and a lot of other decks, because I'm pretty sure everyone knows by now how broken it is, and in this deck it's no exception. So 2 copies of Albert. This card searches you your branded spell and traps when it's summoned, and if you face a fusion monster you control leaves the field by an opponent's card effect or destroyed by battle, you can negate the effect of one monster your opponent controls and you special summon from the graveyard. Unfortunately, if you do that, you won't be able to add again another card because you can only use one or the other of the effects, but still both effects are really good and they come up a lot. Next we have 2 copies of Despia Tragedy. This card searches you a Despia monster when it's sent to the graveyard or banished, and you can banish this card from the graveyard to target a branded spell and trap in your graveyard and you set to the field. Again, you can only use only one of those effects per turn, but it doesn't matter too much because the second effect is a recovery effect, so it's not like you're going to be using it too early, and it's not like you're going to activate a branded fusion, send this to the graveyard, then reset it. You won't be able to activate branded fusion again regardless because it's a once per turn card. So yeah, this card basically gives you the recovery you need during the late game, and the grind game of this deck is really good because it just has more monsters coming back from the grave and spells and traps that are being able to recycle themselves due to the effect of Despia Tragedy, so you can keep bringing out a lot more beaters so you can destroy your opponent. We have 1 copy of Despia Comedy. Now this card is basically a hand trap. When your opponent activates a card or effect that targets a face-up Despia card you control, you can discard this card and negate the effect, and if it's in your graveyard you can tribute a fusion monster as a quick effect to special summon this card from your hand. So it basically doubles down on the amount of cards you can dodge with this card, because for example when you summon an Albion or Lubellion and use its effect to use another fusion summon, then your opponent like Veilers or Imperms, you can discard this card to negate that effect. And also during the late game when you're trying to do basically the same thing and the same scenario happens, you can quick effect tribute your monster that's being targeted this card from the graveyard to dodge that effect as well. So it has like the same effect kinda, and you can use it at 2 different occasions, but you just need it as a one-off because most of the time you're not going to search this card, you're going to send to the graveyard as fusion material and then you're going to use the grave effect. If you happen to draw it, it'll be useful, but it's not something that you really want because it kinda relies on your opponent in order to be useful. If they never use a targeting effect, then this card is never going to resolve, so as a one-off it's a really good card. We have 1 copy of Ad Libitum Despia. This card is basically the power play of the deck. So the field effect is that during your main phase you can make all monsters on the field gain attack equal to their own level, which in this deck is huge because all the monsters are huge levels, but the effect you're going to be using it more is that if its card is used as a fusion material, you can basically target a Despia monster or a level 8 or higher fusion monster that is either in your graveyard or banished, and you special summon it. Unfortunately, it cannot special summon itself, which would be useful a lot of times because of the powerful field effect, but it doesn't matter too much just because the amount of recovery that this card provides for the deck is absolutely ridiculous, because you just have so many good fusion monsters that you can summon throughout the game that they're going to end up in the graveyard anyway, so when you bring them back along with summoning another fusion monster because you already fused in order to use this card's effect, you just get so much power on the field that it's absolutely amazing that you can basically just destroy your opponent very quickly with this deck. This deck doesn't struggle with defeating your opponent. The amount of damage that it provides with all the high level fusion monsters is absurd. We have 2 copies of Fallen of ALBAZ. You need to play 2 just because of branded fusion. There is a way to infinitely use branded fusion because of Lubellion being able to shuffle back Fallen of ALBAZ every time you use it from the deck as material, so you can keep basically having materials in the deck. But when you're trying to summon Dragoon in the deck, which is something that the OCG never had with branded, it's something that we can test for ourselves and see if it works or not, but I feel like it's good to experiment at least at first with the card just because of how powerful Dragoon is. so this will force you to summon Albion sometimes, so you will have to banish ALBAZ. So if you banish the first copy, you need a second copy in your deck, otherwise you're not going to be able to resolve Branded Fusion for the rest of the duel, so basically that's why you play two. We play one copy of Light Hexil Fusion. This card is here just for Dragoon. If Dragoon ends up being a flop once again, which it might, Dragoon is a card that everyone thought was going to be super broken when it first came out, and it ended up not being that good, but again, we have a chance to give it a try and see how it goes. So if you play Dragoon in your deck, you need this card to substitute for Dark Magician. If you're not playing Dragoon, then there's no reason for this card being in the deck, but again, we'll see how it goes. For now, we're playing with it, and we'll see exactly how good it is. We have 3 copies of Water Enchanters of the Temple. Of course, I mentioned it again, this package is just so good for the deck. It just makes sure that the best power card of the deck resolves, which is the most important thing with Branded Fusion. But again, if you don't have access to these cards, then don't feel forced to play them. The deck can still work really well without these cards, even as a pure deck, just because of how many searches the deck has, how many of recovery plays the deck has. Even without Branded Fusion, even though I say it's a choke point, the deck does have plays without Branded Fusion, even if it gets negated. I'll get to that a little bit later. But yeah, this engine just offers so much for pretty much any deck at this format. This engine is just everywhere. So in a deck like this, where it does have really good synergy, of course we're gonna play. And we have the one copy of the Wandering Griffin Rider. Of course, this is why this engine is so good. If this card leaves, then I feel like this engine is just going to completely disappear from the format, but I just don't see Konami doing it, at least not yet. But yeah, of course, an Omni Negate that just so easy to get on the field will always be good. Now, we do play a lot of hand drops in the deck. This is a deck that does not need a lot of cards to play. Maybe sometimes one Aluber is enough, one Branded Fusion is enough, or if you just open a combination of Branded Opening or Water Enchanters, you can do a lot. So you can main deck a lot of hand drops to try to slow down your opponent, because this deck works so well in a simplified game state. So we have 3 copies of Ash Blossom. Of course, this card is the most generic one. We play 3 copies of Effect Veiler. I'm considering changing this because I don't know exactly how good Veiler is this format, but the thing is, if people start playing Branded more, then Veiler and Imperm are going to become much better, just because the Branded Fusion doesn't summon the problematic monster immediately. It summons a stepping stone monster that's going to fuse again in order to summon Mirror Jade, which is usually the monster you're going to have to deal with. So Veiler and Imperm, while right now may not be the best cards, if Branded Fusion starts seeing a lot of play as a deck and as an engine in other decks, then these 2 hand drops are going to become much more useful. We have 3 copies of Ghost Ogre. Of course, with the adventure package being everywhere, this card just makes sense to play at 3, and even without it, if your opponent tries to use Lubellion and Albion to go for a Mirror Jade, if you Ghost Ogre that monster, then sometimes having one less monster on the field can actually help you, because, for example, this card against Brandon, if they don't open with the adventure package, there's not much you can hit, but having one less monster to deal with can sometimes be really good, just because if you have to deal with just Dragoon, then it might not be that problematic, because all those beaters of the deck, sometimes even when they don't have an effect, just your opponent having that much attack power on the board can put you on a clock that basically you have to deal with early, otherwise you're going to get OTK during the following turn. So the less monsters you can make your opponent have when you're playing against this deck, then the more chances you have of surviving, so you can actually get more chances to deal with their board. For the spell cards, we have 3 copies of Branded Fusion. This is the brand new card that's basically going to become one additional engine that you're going to be seeing a lot, either in this deck or in other decks. Fortunately, it's not as splashable as the adventure package, thank god, because if it was, then how many more engines could we put in that base deck, because this card forces you to play only fusions for the entire turn that you activate, which is good because all those other engines like DP and the adventure package, the restrictions are basically non-existent. So you can just link, you can do anything you want, and you just slap these on top of your combos and you have a really powerful board. This card, if it's splashed, it's going to be splashed in full fusion decks. For example, you're going to see it in Shadows or other type of decks that they don't even need link monsters to work. If you just play an extra deck like that has 12 or 13 fusion monsters and maybe 1 or 2 links that can go well in specific scenarios that you're not going to rely on even sometimes. So this is why this card is going to be used in these types of decks. But yeah, you're not going to see it as often as the adventure package, not even close, but it's a card that people will try to splash in a lot of other decks that either use only fusions or that they don't use the extra deck. We have 3 copies of Branded Opening. This is the reason this deck has a really good synergy with the adventure package, because this card basically bypasses the restriction of Water Enchanters and Aramazes, so you can just special summon your Aluber from the deck and you get its effect to search this way. So yeah, this card basically being an e-tailer for the deck, really good. We have 2 copies of Branded in Red. Now this is another card that if you're not playing the adventure package, I would definitely max out, because when you're trying to play through negates without the adventure package, this is the card that's going to push through your opponent's negates, because it's a card that adds a Despia monster from the graveyard to your hand, and then you can fusion summon, because the being able to fusion summon multiple times a turn, aside from just getting your Branded Fusion negated and basically calling it a turn, this is what this deck is all about. So this card is one of those extenders. Another engine you might want to think about if you're not playing the Water Enchanters or Amazer combo is the Frightful Patchwork stuff, because it just gives you more ways to fusion, which is the game of the deck. You just need need to be able to fusion as many times as possible. This is why every single fusion spell is going to bait and negate, and as long as you have another one in your hand, then you will be able to play. So yeah, Branded Rend in this deck is a 2-off, but definitely a 3-off if you're playing without the adventure stuff. We have 3 copies of Rite of Haramazir, of course, you have to max out as well, with 1 copy of Journey of Destiny and 1 copy of Draco back. Now, of course, these 2 cards just go really well, and I feel like for anyone who was thinking that Draco back might be a cuttable card for the engine because it's a brick. Yes, of course it's a brick, but I feel like, especially now that we saw with everything in the YCS, we saw just how powerful Draco back is. So I feel like anyone who is still complaining about how brick this card is and that they were considering of cutting it from the deck in any type of deck that we were playing the adventure package, I feel like now everyone has just been convinced of how good this card is. It just out so many things, it gives you so much pressure. So even if it's a brick, yes, if you draw it on its own, it doesn't do anything, but it just offers so much as a searchable card. So I feel like the reward is so worth the cost, so you need to play this card if you're playing the adventure package. 1 copy of Foolish Burial, because you can send Water Enchantress to the graveyard with this card, and you can also use this in combination with your cards for the Despia to be able to use the graveyard effects as well, so it has both purposes for the deck. And the last spell is 1 copy of Called by the Grave, because again, you need your Brand Fusion to resolve. It loses to Ash, so you're going to use the Called by to stop. For the trap cards, we have 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence, rounding out the total hand trap count to 12. Of course, you can switch around with numbers. If you feel like you may need to main deck Nibiru, then of course you can do that. But I feel like Veiler and Imperm, while not as good as of now, once this structure deck gets more popular and people actually start playing the engine or the deck more and more, then these cards are going to become much more beneficial for you. For the extra deck, we have 2 copies of Albion, the Branded Dragon. This is a monster that helps you go into Dragoon because you need to send a Fallen of Albaz and a light monster to summon this, so this is why the Light Hex Seal fusion is so good, so you can basically banish the Albaz and the Light Hex being substituted as a Dark Magician to summon your Dragoon. Now, the thing is that this you're going to make a Dragoon that is not as powerful as the Dragoons we've making with Anaconda, just because it's not going to have the threat potential of game because it doesn't have any normal monsters as material, so it's not like it's going to pop monsters and burn. It's just here for the negation effect and a monster that's hard to deal with. And again, I'm not exactly sure if this is going to become a standard for the deck, but I feel like just because the OCG never had a chance to test this deck with Dragoon, we might as well do it at least for the beginning of the format with this new deck, so we can at least see for ourselves if it's good or not. And of course, if it's not, we're gonna improvise and change the deck. But this card, because of how it's worded and because of how it works, we can play Dragoon in the deck. We have 2 copies of Lubellion. Now, this card is the card that helps you go for the super grind game, just because you basically keep shuffling back your Fallen of Albaz from the graveyard back into the deck, so you can fusion summon, and because you shuffle them back, Branded Fusion is always live. As long as you keep resolving Lubellion, you're going to be able to resolve all 3 Branded Fusions, or maybe even more if you set them back from the graveyard throughout the game, so it's very easy to keep spamming all those monsters on the field. And all of these cards, even though they don't do anything on their own, aside from giving you another fusion monster, they are big monsters, so which is why I said this deck puts your opponent on a clock with all these big monsters that it summons, so you can basically have to deal with them right away, otherwise you're going to lose in a single turn. We have 2 copies of Mirror Jade. Now, this is the disruption of the deck, the inherent disruption aside from Dragoon, which is basically a card that you can summon by using Fallen of Albaz and a fusion Synchro Xyz or Link monster, so it's very easy to summon because when you summon your Albion or your Lubellion, you basically fuse their selves away along with a Fallen of Albaz in the graveyard, so you can summon this guy, and this card basically says that as a quick effect, you can send a fusion monster that lists Fallen of Albaz from your extra deck of the graveyard to banish a monster on the field, and you cannot use that effect during the next turn, which is why this card has some kind of restriction. But the thing is, I feel like the second effect of this card is actually much more devastating than the first effect, which goes, if your opponent deals with it, if this card leaves the field by an opponent's card, you can activate this effect that you can destroy all monsters your opponent controls during the end phase of this turn. So it's an effect that has to get negated at the point of being sent to the graveyard because it won't activate again during the end phase. So in order for your opponent to deal with this card, they have to get a negate on the board before they deal with it. But if they try to do that, you can basically bait that negate with the first effect, and by the time they deal with this effect, you can use the second effect, and during the end phase, unless they put up another negate on the board, then they're going to lose their entire board entirely. So I feel like this card is very threatening for your opponent, no matter how they try to deal with it, which is why I think this card is really, really good, and is the reason the deck might even work without Dragoon. You might prioritize this card over Dragoon, just because Dragoon on paper seems broken, but I guarantee you that a card like Mirror Jade is more powerful, and especially in this deck, than Dragoon. But sometimes you just need this extra negation or Omni Negate, depending on what you're playing against, because the first effect of this card sometimes might be a little bit redundant against certain matchups, while the Omni Negate is good against pretty much anything you're playing against. For example, if you're playing against Eldritch, then Mirror Jade's effects doesn't do much during the early game. Your opponent is not going to have any monsters on the field to banish with the first effect or destroy with the second effect, which is why I feel like Dragoon will give this deck a better matchup against control types of decks as well, because this deck kind of struggles with control. It's not meant to deal with those decks, but Dragoon might deal with them just because of the omni-negate part and how resilient it is. Next, we have 2 copies of Masquerade Blazing Dragon. This is basically the flare metal of the deck. It's a monster that makes your opponent pay 600 life points to activate effects, and of course, if this card is in the graveyard, it's basically a self-occurring monster. If your opponent controls a Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, or Link monster, you can special summon this card from the graveyard, and then you banish it when it leaves the field. But again, it's another monster that even if your opponent deals with, they will have paid some amount of life points to deal with it, and then they're going to have to deal with it again next turn, which is why, again, I keep saying that this deck just keeps sticking all those big monsters on the field, and they're very resilient as well, being able to revive themselves with effects like this, so you get a lot of damage on the board for free. We have 1 copy of Despia and Critis. This card is another monster that you can use to basically close out the game because it has a quick effect that you can change the attack of all monsters on the field to 0 except level 8 or higher fusion monsters. So when you're trying to go for a game, this card will help you being able to basically reduce all of your opponent's monster attack to 0. Your monsters are going to have their attack because they're all level 8 or higher fusion monsters, and you're going to attack for game. We have 1 copy of Dragoon. I mentioned this card. We'll see how it goes. I feel like just being able to play around decks like Eldritch or other decks like this is good of enough reason to play the 1 brick in the main deck, being Light Hex Seal Fusion, and this card in the extra deck, just to be able to do well against these types of matchups, because again, from the YCS, I feel like people were not expecting pure types of Eldritch decks to do well, but they did really well, so people might start playing it more. So when they do, in order for this deck to play around them, then Dragoon is going to be the key part, the key component of being able to defeat those decks. We have 1 copy of Guardian Chimera. Now this is a generic piece of support that helps this deck immensely, especially going second. Even if you're playing without Adventure or with Adventure, this card is just so good. Being able to pop cards, being able to destroy cards, it just gives your opponent a card to think about whenever they're trying to negate something, because what if my opponent can fusion summon again and summon this guy, and they're basically going to draw cards and destroy my board, so your opponent always has to think about this card being a threat, so with this why this card is really good. We play 1 copy of Titanic Lad. This is here mainly to use for Fallen of ALBAZ's Super Poly type of effect, because Fallen of ALBAZ is not your typical brick. If you draw it, it has uses, especially with all those different types of monsters you can summon with different summoning requirements, with one being always Fallen of ALBAZ, and the second one being either an attribute or an attack like this. You basically have options to deal with any type of monster, so this is why this card is here, and to basically to take any monster with 2500 or more attack points, because if you're playing against a deck that has attributes that are not light or dark, and especially if they're playing without their extra deck, so you can't even summon your Mirror Jade or something like that, so this card is here just for those reasons. And if it goes to the graveyard, you can special summon a Fallen of ALBAZ from your deck, so sometimes you can send this to the graveyard with Mirror Jade, and then summon Fallen of ALBAZ from the deck, and then use Fallen of ALBAZ's effect immediately because it's a non-summon effect and it's not a once per turn effect or something like that. So you can kinda make your Mirror Jade a 2-piece interruption, because you can banish a monster, and then during your end phase, your opponent either has to worry about Mirror Jade's graveyard effect if they dealt with it, or Titanic Lad's effect during the end phase that will summon the ALBAZ from the deck to super poly one of your opponent's cards, so your opponent has to be very careful when dealing with these types of effects. We have 1 copy of Dracostapelia. Now this card is here mainly because in this format, if this deck becomes popular, then super poly is going to become a huge side deck option for pretty much any type of deck. So this card, including a fusion monster and a dark monster, it's very easy to summon, especially if Dragoon becomes a standard card for the deck. You're going to need super poly no matter what deck you're playing, because you're going to get so much value out of a super poly when your opponent plays with Albion or Lubellion, and then they have a Dragoon on the field as well. So this card, it will just give you much more freedom when you're playing. And for the Link monsters, we only have 2. We play 1 copy of Relinquished Anima because we do play some level 1 monsters in the deck, so sometimes when your opponent forgets that this card exists, and you can maybe punish them by stealing their monster. And we have 1 copy of Anaconda. Now Anaconda works weirdly with Branded Fusion, because like I said, Branded Fusion, if you're trying to summon Dragoon, you summon a Stepping Stone monster, so you cannot do that with Anaconda because you cannot summon anything else after you summon that 1 fusion monster. But you can summon Mirror Jade because Anaconda is a Link monster, so by sending Branded Fusion, you send your ALBAZ and Anaconda himself from the field to the grave, and you summon Mirror Jade. So in some scenarios, Anaconda will come up. It's not as important as you think it is, so even if this card, for example, gets banned in the next list, I don't feel like it'll change much for the deck, but as long as we have it, it just gives you something extra to do, and the extra deck space is not tight at all, so it's not like we have any problem with playing it in the deck. So yep, that's the deck, guys. I feel like this deck is just going to make a huge impact in the format, and I can't wait to see exactly what people come up this deck, because this is basically the standard build that the OCG has been playing for quite a while, but us TCG players like to make things way differently, so who knows what people will come up with for this deck. I can't wait to see exactly what people are going to play, maybe in this deck as an engine or in any type of other deck. We're going to see much more variety, which I feel like as long as we don't get a new ban list, then this is the best thing we can ask. Just more decks to play and watch, especially now with the live YCSs back in the scene once again. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.